Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that you flagged as particularly interesting, government spending. We've got quite the opinion piece to unpack here. Government waste, absurd spending exposed by David Vogel.
David Vogel. Yeah, he comes at this from a fascinating perspective. He's a retired CEO, founder of the Church of Unity Society, and a self-disclosed solar energy mentor.
Oh, wow. He's clearly someone who's managed budgets, understands complex systems, and has strong opinions about ethical leadership.
Yeah, you're right. It's not every day we hear from someone with that kind of background taking on this topic. And to really hammer home his point, he quotes Michael Franzese.
Oh, yeah.
You might remember him as a former mafia capo who has since become a pretty vocal critic of, shall we say, shady financial dealings.
Right.
Franzese actually claims the government is a bigger racket than the mob.
Wow.
Pretty bold statement, don't you think? Franzese's background certainly gives his statement a certain weight, but Vogel doesn't stop there. He backs it up with a whopping 50 examples of what he considers wasteful government spending. I have to admit, some of these examples definitely made me raise an eyebrow.
50 examples. So where does he even begin with all of that?
Well, he starts by framing government waste not just as a financial issue, but as a betrayal of public trust.
Okay.
He argues that every dollar wasted erodes the faith citizens have in their government.
That makes sense. I mean, we all pay taxes. We all rely on government services.
Right.
So we're all invested in this literally. And when we see our hard-earned money going towards things that seem frivolous or unnecessary, it's bound to make us question where our priorities lie as a nation.
Exactly. And Vogel really leans into that sense of frustration with his list of examples. He kicks things off with what he calls absurd scientific research. And some of these are pretty out there.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that shrimp on a treadmill study. $50,000. I mean, what could they possibly be hoping to learn from that?
Right. And then there's the study on duck penises to the tune of $1.8 million.
What?
I'll admit, even with my background in research, I had to do a double take on that one.
Yeah, some of these studies do sound pretty ridiculous, but is it possible that there's more to them than meets the eye? I mean, research can be complex, and maybe there are long-term benefits we're not seeing.
That's a fair point. It's easy to cherry-pick examples that sound silly out of context, but I think what Vogel is getting at here is the bigger question of how these research projects get funded in the first place. There's a whole system in place to evaluate and allocate research dollars, and it's not always transparent to the public.
That's a good point. So how does that process work? Who decides which studies get funded?
Well, typically, researchers submit proposals to government agencies like the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health. These proposals are then reviewed by panels of experts who evaluate the scientific merit, feasibility, and potential impact of the proposed research.
So it's not just a bunch of bureaucrats throwing darts at a board and deciding which studies sound the most entertaining.
Definitely not, although some of the titles might make you think otherwise. But even with a rigorous review process, there's always going to be debate about which projects deserve funding. There's limited money to go around, and researchers are always pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Okay, that helps put things in perspective a bit. But even if there is a sound process behind it, I can see how seeing these headlines about shrimp treadmills and duck penises might make people question whether their tax dollars are being used wisely.
Absolutely. And it's not just scientific research that raises these questions. Vogel goes on to highlight what he calls foreign aid gone stupid.
Oh yeah, that's where things start to get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean potentially infuriating.
He cites a number of examples that are sure to raise eyebrows, including a $1.5 million program to promote caviar exports in Iran.
Wait, did we have sanctions against Iran at that time? It does seem a bit contradictory to be helping them sell luxury goods. And I remember reading about the program to teach Chinese prostitutes to drink responsibly. While I appreciate the concern for public health, it does make you wonder if that's really the best use of our foreign aid budget.
These examples definitely highlight the complexities of foreign aid. Where do we draw the line between helping other nations and meddling in their internal affairs? How do we balance our own interests with global responsibility?
Tough questions indeed. But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, I want to hear about some of Vogel's other examples. What else does he consider wasteful spending?
He goes on to target what he calls military and infrastructure insanity. And this is where the numbers get really big.
Let me guess, we're talking billions, not millions, right?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about a $43 million gas station built in Afghanistan when a comparable station in Pakistan cost only $300,000. Then there's the billions spent on empty airplanes and the infamous airship that never even flew.
Wow, those are some serious discrepancies in costs. I can see why he calls it insanity. But is it fair to label all of this as waste? Could there be other factors at play that justify the higher costs?
That's a valid point. Building a gas station in a war zone like Afghanistan is inherently more expensive and complex than building one in a peaceful country like Pakistan. You have to consider security concerns, logistical challenges, and potentially even corruption. And the same goes for military projects. Developing cutting-edge technology is rarely cheap, and sometimes projects fail. But I think Vogel is raising a valid point about the need for greater oversight and accountability when it comes to these massive expenditures.
I agree. When we're talking about billions of dollars, we need to make sure that money is being spent wisely and effectively. But before we move on, I want to touch on one more point. Vogel also criticizes government spending on media projects like an Iraqi Sesame Street and research on how college students use Facebook. Do those really qualify as waste?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced. These projects may not seem as outrageous as shrimp treadmills or million-dollar duck penis studies, but they do raise questions about the role of government in research and information dissemination. Should the government be funding projects that seem, well, obvious or unnecessary?
Or should those resources be directed elsewhere?
Exactly. It all comes back to priorities. What do we, as a society, consider to be the most pressing needs, and how should our government allocate its resources accordingly?
It's definitely something to think about. Okay, so we've covered absurd scientific research, foreign aid gone wrong, and military and infrastructure insanity. What else does Vogel have in store for us?
Well, he doesn't stop there. He dives into government-funded research on love, relationships, and social media. We're talking about studies on why people lie on dating profiles, whether Facebook makes you lonely, and the psychology behind selfies.
That's interesting and kind of relatable, to be honest. But I have to admit, I'm struggling to see how those topics warrant government funding. I mean, are those really pressing national concerns?
It's almost as if he's trying to highlight the absurdity of it all by juxtaposing the seemingly trivial with the truly pressing issues facing our society. But is that an effective strategy?
That's a great question. Does relying on shock value and humor risk trivializing the issue? Could it potentially alienate people who might be open to a more nuanced discussion?
It's definitely a risk, but it's also possible that Vogel's approach could be effective in grabbing people's attention and sparking a conversation about government spending.
So is it a necessary evil?
Perhaps, but even if these examples seem frivolous, they still raise questions about transparency and accountability. How are these decisions being made? Who is benefiting from this research? And are these the best ways to allocate limited resources?
Valid points. So where does Vogel go from here?
He throws us a rapid-fire round of examples from all sorts of categories: arts, entertainment, food, you name it.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about a study on how to make jazz more popular, a replica of a sunken ship, research on ketchup, ice cream, and popcorn. The list goes on and on.
Okay, now I'm starting to get a little overwhelmed. Is there a method to his madness?
I think what Vogel is trying to do here is hammer home his point about the sheer volume of spending that he considers wasteful. It's not just a few bad apples, it's a pervasive culture of overspending and misplaced priorities. And he brings us back to Michael Franzese's claim that the government is a bigger racket than the mob.
That's a pretty serious accusation. What's your take on that?
Well, as we discussed earlier, Franzese comes from a world where corruption was rampant. He's seen firsthand how systems can be manipulated for personal gain. His perspective is certainly valuable, even if it's controversial.
So is he saying that the government is inherently corrupt?
I don't think it's that simple. There are certainly instances of corruption at all levels of government, just as there is in any large organization. But I think Franzese is more likely pointing to the systemic issues that can lead to waste and inefficiency. The bureaucracy, the lack of transparency, the influence of special interests, all of these factors can contribute to a culture where money is wasted and accountability is lacking.
That's a good point. It's not necessarily about individuals being intentionally corrupt. It's about the systems and structures that allow waste to flourish.
Exactly. And that's where Vogel's call to action comes in. He emphasizes that awareness is the first step towards accountability. We need to pay attention to how our money is being spent and demand better from our elected officials.
So it's not enough to just sit here and shake our heads at these outrageous examples. We have to actually do something about it.
Precisely. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of this deep dive. How can we, as citizens, make a difference? How can we hold our government accountable for responsible spending?
This is already getting me fired up. We'll be right back after a quick break to dive into that very question. Don't go anywhere. All right, so we've heard Vogel's laundry list of what he considers to be wasteful government spending. But knowing about it is one thing. Actually doing something about it feels like a whole other challenge.
I hear you. It's easy to feel powerless when faced with these kinds of systemic issues, but remember what Gogol said, awareness is the first step toward accountability. And becoming aware isn't just about knowing a problem exists, it's about understanding the nuances, the complexities, the different perspectives at play.
Okay, that's a good point. So how do we go beyond just feeling outraged by these examples and actually start to understand the bigger picture? Where do we even begin?
Well, one thing you can do is look beyond the headlines and really dig into the details. Those attention-grabbing titles don't always tell the whole story. Often, the research Vogel cites has a valid rationale behind it, even if it's not immediately apparent. Take that $43 million gas station in Afghanistan, for instance.
Right.
It might seem ridiculous compared to the $300,000 station in Pakistan, but consider the context.
Right. We were talking about building in a war zone versus a peaceful country. There are going to be added costs for security, logistics, transportation, maybe even corruption.
Exactly. And when it comes to things like foreign aid, there are so many factors to consider. What are the goals of a particular program? Who are the intended beneficiaries? What are the potential long-term impacts? Just labeling something as stupid doesn't give us a full understanding of the situation.
That makes sense. So instead of just accepting Vogel's assessment at face value, we need to think critically about the context surrounding each example. But let's be real, most of us aren't experts in government budgeting or foreign aid. How can we realistically expect to understand the intricacies of every spending decision?
You're right. It would be impossible to become an expert on everything. But there are ways to stay informed without getting overwhelmed. One strategy is to diversify your sources of information. Don't just rely on opinion pieces or news articles that may have their own biases.
So what else should we be looking at?
Pay attention to budget discussions at the local, state, and federal levels. Look for independent analyses from watchdog groups and think tanks. There are a lot of organizations out there dedicated to providing objective information about government spending.
Okay, so we've done our homework, we've formed our own opinions about what constitutes wasteful spending, now what? How do we actually make a difference? Is it really as simple as writing a strongly worded letter to our congressman?
It's a bit more involved than that, but you're on the right track. It's about civic engagement. It's about making your voice heard and participating in the political process.
Okay, so give us the rundown. What does meaningful civic engagement actually look like?
It starts with contacting your elected representatives. Let them know what issues you care about and how you feel about specific spending decisions. Attend town hall meetings, participate in public forums. Those are great opportunities to engage in dialogue with your representatives and other members of your community.
I guess those are more effective than just ramping on social media, huh?
Well, social media can be a useful tool for raising awareness and connecting the like-minded individuals, but it's important to go beyond that. And of course, one of the most important things you can do is vote. Research the candidates, understand their positions on government spending, and support those who align with your values.
So it's about being informed, being vocal, and showing up. But what about those of us who are feeling a bit more ambitious? Are there other ways to have an impact?
Absolutely. You can support organizations that advocate for transparency and accountability in government spending. There are a lot of great nonprofits out there doing important work in this area. You can volunteer your time, donate to their cause, or simply help spread the word about their efforts.
Okay, I'm starting to feel a little more empowered here. It sounds like there are actually a lot of ways to get involved and make a difference. But even with all of that, I still wonder, does any of this actually change anything? Is the system really going to change just because a bunch of us speak up about wasteful spending?
It's a valid question, and honestly, there's no easy answer. Government bureaucracy can be slow-moving, and change rarely happens overnight. But I firmly believe that every voice counts. The more people who demand transparency and accountability, the more pressure there is on elected officials to deliver.
So you're saying there's hope?
Hope, and more importantly, agency. We have the power to shape the future of our government, but that power comes with responsibility. It's up to each and every one of us to decide what kind of world we want to live in and then work towards making that vision a reality.
I love that. So going back to Vogel's piece, what's your overall take? Is he being too alarmist? Is the government truly a bigger racket than the mob?
That's a tough one. I think Vogel is deliberately provocative to get people thinking critically about government spending. Whether or not you agree with his assessment, he raises important questions about transparency, accountability, and the allocation of public resources. And that's a conversation worth having.
You're right. Even if we don't agree with everything he says, he's definitely got us thinking, right? And that's really the point of all of this, isn't it?
Exactly. He's challenging us to be more informed, more engaged, and more demanding of our government. He's reminding us that we have a voice and that we can make a difference.
Well said. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to one of Vogel's main arguments, the idea that government waste is a betrayal of public trust. How do we rebuild that trust? What are the practical steps we can take as individuals and as a society?
That's a great question, and a crucial one to consider if we want to move forward in a positive direction. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of this deep dive. Stay with us.
All right, we're back and ready to tackle the big question. How do we rebuild trust in government when it comes to spending? We explored Vogel's examples, we discussed the complexities of budgeting and foreign aid, and even brainstormed ways to engage in the political process. But where do we go from here?
Well, rebuilding trust is a two-way street. It requires effort from both the government and the citizens. On the government side, it starts with transparency. We need clear, accessible information about how our tax dollars are being spent.
Right, because if people don't understand where their money's going, it's easy to assume the worst. I think we've all seen those sensational headlines about outrageous government spending. It's hard not to get cynical when you're constantly bombarded with those kind of stories.
Exactly. So transparency is key to combating that cynicism. We need detailed budgets, clear explanations of funding decisions, and easy-to-understand reports on program outcomes.
So basically, less bureaucratic jargon, more plain English.
Precisely. The information needs to be accessible to everyone, not just policy wonks and budget analysts. But transparency alone isn't enough. We also need accountability.
What does that look like in practice?
It means having mechanisms in place to ensure that funds are being used responsibly and effectively. It means establishing clear performance metrics for government programs and holding agencies accountable for meeting those goals.
So it's not just about tracking where the money goes, it's about making sure that money is actually achieving something worthwhile.
Exactly. And if a program isn't working, we need to be willing to make changes, whether that means adjusting the funding, revising the goals, or even scrapping the program altogether.
That makes sense. But how do we ensure that this accountability actually happens? Is it just a matter of trusting that our elected officials will do the right thing?
Trust is important, but it needs to be earned. We need strong oversight mechanisms, both within the government itself and from independent watchdog organizations. We need a system that encourages whistleblowers to come forward without fear of reprisal.
So it's about creating a culture where accountability is valued and rewarded rather than punished.
Exactly. And that brings us to the citizens' role in all of this. Transparency and accountability are only effective if citizens are engaged and informed.
Okay, so we're back to that idea of civic engagement. But honestly, it can be really discouraging to think about taking on something as big as government spending. What can one person realistically hope to achieve?
It's true that one person alone can't change the entire system, but remember, every movement starts with individuals who care enough to speak up and demand better. And when those voices join together, they can create a powerful force for change.
So it's about finding your voice, connecting with others who share your concerns, and working together to hold our elected officials accountable.
Exactly. And it's not just about complaining or criticizing, it's about offering constructive solutions, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and working collaboratively to create a more responsible and effective government.
I love that. It's about being part of the solution, not just dwelling on the problems.
Precisely. And remember, rebuilding trust takes time. It's an ongoing process that requires sustained effort from both sides. But it's a goal worth striving for, because a government that is transparent, accountable, and responsive to its citizens is essential for a healthy democracy.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive into government spending has been eye-opening, to say the least. We've explored some truly outrageous examples, but we've also uncovered some important insights about the complexities of budgeting, the challenges of foreign aid, and the crucial role of civic engagement.
And hopefully it's left you feeling empowered rather than discouraged.
Exactly. Remember, knowledge is power, and action is where the real magic happens. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the ideas that matter.